Okay, so hi all, which I think is what, five of us. Um, Glenn asked me to put this together in a short time frame, so excuse me if it's a little bit appears a little bit rushed, but I hope you'll enjoy it. I recently wrote an article about one of the Malvern men, which is what I do. I research all of the veterans from Malvern Collegiate for both wars. But the first war is the specialty I do because the records are so much easier to get. The second war is harder to get them, if especially if they've survived the war, because you have to. There's a privacy limit on when you can get at the records. So anyway, the First World War is where I spend most of my time, and I wrote an article about one of the Malvern guys, and I looked into his service file, and there was almost nothing in it. And I thought, well, how am I going to write about this? And so I decided to look in. I said, well, let me see in the newspaper what was going on at the time. And I found this amazing set of stories and things that connected a bunch of dots, which is what I'm going to talk about. But it took this, nondescript private named William Albert Heel, and it turned it into quite a story that I was able to write for my magazine. And I'm going to use some of that magazine story in here. But then what I did was I said, well, one of the things I always wonder about these men is what made them decide to enlist, especially after President Trump's latest comments about losers and suckers. Um, it is quite a decision to go to war. Even if you didn't know what the horrors of the First World War were going to be, you still knew that wars were dangerous. So what makes people decide that they want to do it? So we're going to sort of look at some reasons. It's hard. You can't have any definitive answers because these men are no longer alive, so you can't really know unless you've got letters and records and things. But even then, most of them didn't want to talk about the war. So we're going to look at some possibilities and what was going on at the time and see what we can come up with. So here are some of the known reasons. That's a recruiting drive in the street there with a streetcar. 85% of Canada were recent British ancestry. And a lot of them were very recent. Some go back, 100 years or more, but some of them were very recent. My grandfather came to Canada in 1911 from England. And immediately when the war was declared, they all wanted to support the mother country. So patriotism was a big thing. After the war, immediately after the war started, people were outraged that the German army invaded Belgium, and there were atrocity stories that came along with that, which is, a lot of propaganda. But still, just in itself, invading a neutral country really offended people. Some of the men were looking for adventure. Maybe they'd never been out of the country. They wanted to see France. Kind of a tough way to see France, but anyway, young men, they've got strange reasons for doing a lot of things. Some of them were unemployed or underemployed, and they were looking for a better career. Some maybe wanted to become officers and advance a military career, because in these days it was still, a thing to be proud of to be in the military. Some of them were just fellows who wanted to be with their peers. And unfortunately, there was also pressure from citizens groups, especially women's groups, who took it upon themselves to go around shaming men, handing out white feathers and the like, because they felt they should all be signing up and going to war to support the empire. So a lot of men, when the recruiters came around door to door, they wouldn't even answer the door sometimes because they knew what was up. And then lastly, just in 1917, late 1917, when conscription came in, a lot of men signed up before they were conscripted to avoid the stigma of having been drafted, because there was some stigma attached to not having volunteered, but being forced to go. And here's the invasion of Belgium, the Schlieffen Plan for Germany to swing and do a left hook through Belgium and into France and come at Paris from the west. It had been in the books for many, many years. Germany had planned this long in advance. And you can see the cartoon there, young Belgian Flanders person with his sabot on his feet, and the German with his sausages hanging out of his pocket, bullying the young lad. And people really did feel that the war was a just war to liberate Belgium and defend the empire. So here we go. The war started July 28th with the Austro-Hungarian Empire declaring war on Serbia, which then escalated to include Russia and Germany and then France and Belgium and Britain, and the whole world got into it. Initially, everybody was enthusiastic about the war, and they signed up in droves. It wasn't even a question. Canada was, of course, automatically at war. We were a Dominion, so as soon as Britain declared war, we were at war. And the men flocked to the colors, as they say, and they enlisted. And here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 Malvern men. These are the 7 that signed up in 1914, the earliest. And you can see the variety of ages there, 18 to 24. And throughout, I have lists of names throughout. I'm not going to read them all. If you see a name and you want to know more about it, just ask me or email me. I've got my email at the end of the presentation. But throughout, you'll see the bold names with the asterisk. Those are the men who were killed in the war and who were memorialized on the cenotaph out front of the school. The one that got restored, and we're going to restore it again because they stole the sword. So the first contingent, as it was called, Sam Hughes really threw everything into a Trump-like chaos. He decided to recruit men differently than the traditional way of going through the local militia units. And he just put out a call for men, and he set up this camp in Valcartier, Quebec, because it was near the port that they would sail out of for the front. And there they are. This is the 1st Brigade, 1st Battalion, 1st Brigade, the first group. And you can see all those tents. My grandfather was among them. He was with the engineers, and he was somewhere in one of those tents. In 1915, the spring reinforcing draft came up. The first flush of men, the old soldiers, or the old contemptibles, I think they called them. They had gone to the front. They'd fought at Mons. The war was at a stalemate now, and they needed more men. So in the spring of 1915, there was another reinforcing draft that went out. Not draft in the conscription sense, just a gathering of men. These are all still volunteers. And my grandfather and my great uncle were among them. They signed up on the same day, as a matter of fact, in April 1915. They didn't know each other, and they were to become brothers-in-law. But of course, my great uncle was killed before he knew that my grandfather had an interest in his sister. So that's just a little side through. But by 1915, men knew what they were in for. The stories of the actions and the casualties and everything was in the papers. But still, 43 Malvern men enlisted throughout the year, and 15 of them would eventually be killed in action. And here's a list of the 1915 group. Cecil Pugh Annis is the grainy photograph in the top left. He is the first name, because it starts with A, at the top of the cenotaph on the left-hand side. And his name was unfortunately scraped off by one of the vandals climbing the cenotaph to get at the first vandalism. 36 hours after we rededicated the cenotaph, this clown climbed up and used his Cecil Annis's letters as a foothold, and he scraped off these valuable lead letters from the statue. So we're we're having to replace those, and it's going to cost several $1,000s just to do that. So I wish these vandals would learn a lesson. The other people in the pictures are William Kennedy Commons, his nephew, Chris Commons, still lives in the neighborhood. The lower left is Lieutenant Gordon Parsons Davidson. He was a officer cadet at the U of T. And the fellow on the lower right is Gordon Ezra Duke, and we'll hear more about him a little later on. And you can see in this group, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them were killed. And here's more of the 1915 class. Martin James Flood. The fellow on the top right is Charles Simpson Lennox. His father, Edward Lennox, his uncle, Edward Lennox, was the architect of Toronto's Old City Hall. His father, David Lennox, was also an architect, and the two brothers were very active in building a lot of the Edwardian houses in Toronto. But when Charles Simpson Lennox was killed, he was very young. He was, I think, 19. I'm going to let Ann Livingston in. There we go. When Charles Simpson Lennox was killed, his architect father and uncle wanted a suitable way to memorialize him, and so they commissioned a stained glass window at St. John's Norway Church. And it's the main window, and it was dedicated to all the men of the parish who fell in the war. And then you can see more of the names in highlighted bold with the asterisk who died. The fellow in the lower right corner is, which one is he? I think that's William John Hurd. Yeah. Anyway, here we go. And here's the rest of the list from 1915. Joseph Rollitt Taylor, Raleigh they called him. He was a friend of the Commons brothers, Chester and William. And Chris Commons has a whole bunch of letters written by William Commons, and he mentions his friend, Raleigh Taylor. Unfortunately, they were both killed in the war. Arthur Jackson Smith Sisley, known as Bud. He's one of three brothers. We'll hear more about them a little later here. And this is the magazine that I do, the Maple Leaf, for the Central Ontario Branch Western Front Association. And the cover photo there is of Captain Frank Zammers. And he was an engineer responsible for the little miniature railways that supplied the troops at the front lines. It's a beautiful photograph. I was really lucky to get that from the family. So the story I told you about with William Albert Heel, it turned into my story called A Night at the Pictures. On 31st October 1915, 10 theaters, film theaters across the city were targeted for recruiting nights. And the Peter Pan Theater in the Beach was one of them. And I'll talk about it. It stood on the site of what is now the Beach Mall, but was formerly the Allen Beach Theater. Is the exact location, 1969 Queen East. I'm thinking that it's very likely that he was in the audience that night because they listed all of the men who signed up that night, and his name was among them. So I am guessing that he was at that theater because it was a local one, or perhaps another theater. But my suspicion is he was there that night. So what was going on at the end of October in 1915? Well, one of the most sensational stories at the time has happened October 20th or 21st. Nurse Edith Cavell was executed as a spy and aiding British and Belgian soldiers to escape to the Allied lines. The Germans didn't like this. They arrested her, and they eventually executed her by firing squad. It horrified the world, the Allied world, and it created outrage. People were calling for statues to be put up in her honor. They were really taking the part of the woman who'd been murdered. It was top news for the exact week before the movie night. So it was a strong inducement for people to consider joining to avenge Nurse Cavell's death. At the same time, King George V made a speech calling for more troops. The war had been going on for a year by now, and the battles had taken their toll of the first contingents that went, and they needed more men. So Canada was in the process of deciding what they were going to do, and the call was going out for more men. And so the inducement to join up would have been very strong for that reason too. And then there's this fellow, the infamous Sir Sam Hughes, Canada's Minister of Militia and Defense. He was in Toronto just prior to the movie night, and he said to a recruiting meeting that they held, he said, why are we here in this meeting? I don't think there's one man of recruiting age in the audience. We should go where the right audience is. And that was one of the reasons they did things like going to the theaters. There were other entertainment venues, sporting events, concerts, that sort of thing that men were would go to, and they were always turned into recruiting events when they could. So we had a lot of things working to make the night of October 31st a big night, and I'm pretty sure that it was working in Albert Heel's mind. Mabel Taliaferro. She's a spitting image of one of my former work colleagues, Nicole. And I showed her the picture, and she said, a lot of people say I look like somebody else. She said, but in this case, I really think that does look like me. She was pleased. That's what a movie star looked like in 1915. And of course, Charlie Chaplin was very popular. And here we go, the Peter Pan Theater. You'll see there the picture of the Beach Theater. That was built in 1920. David Minier, the fellow standing in the picture here, he was the owner of the Peter Pan Theater, which had been in his storefront. He lived in the house in the back, and a lot of theaters in those days were called storefront theaters, or perhaps his was a little bigger, but they were very small. And he had plans to build a bigger 480-seat theater, and he had actually filed his plans with the city. But then he died in 1919 and didn't get to do it. I know one of the other speakers that we've had at our group before, Glenn, you may remember his name, the film historian who's spoken to us. Mm-hmm. He did not know about the Peter Pan Theater in any detail. So he was very excited to, and he and I were collaborating on this a little bit, and he was excited to find out. And I actually found a member of the Minier family who provided this wonderful photo, and that's David Minier and his wife. He also had a theater down at Yonge and Dundas, way before it was a square with lots of theaters. So movie night, 1915, there was a full program with speakers, guest speakers, grandees they would call them in older times, veterans returned from the war, and notables from the city establishment like Alex Fraser, who was a journalist, a historian, a lecturer, and he was he helped found the 48th Highlanders, which is Toronto's, most people would say it's Toronto's premier regiment. And he was an aide to the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario at the time too. And this was a whole evening of entertainment. It featured songs, films. There probably was a piano and a band, and the speakers. And one of the speakers was a really funny character, a sergeant who had a lot of tall war story tales to tell, a lot of which are doubtable because I've been through his service file, and it turns out his main claim to fame was that he was an alcoholic. So he larded it on pretty good for the troops. And here is a little short film clip I want to play for you. This is this was the most popular song of the war.
Johnny good luck to Johnny Canuck and all the Allied soldiers. They're fighting day by day in trenches far away. They'll all march back with the Union Jack. In history they'll gain fame. Just give them a cheer and banish the tear, for they'll return again. Good luck to the boys of the Allies. Let's cheer them on their way. Come Union Jack, they're proud of, while fighting day by day. When the band plays that you go to Prairie, the joy right in their eyes. God save our greatest king. Good luck to the boys of the Allies.
Great old tune, very popular, and I can just imagine people in the theater singing that because it was a real hit tune at the time. And of course, in those days, sheet music was very popular, and there's a picture of the sheet music for the song. There we go. And then here is the Battle of the Scarpe, which is where Albert Heel met his end. He was with the 20th Battalion. This is a typical French field that would have been scarred with trenches and craters and dugouts and things. The 20th Battalion was on this side, as where we are looking at it, and they had to cross that open space to get to the villages on the opposite side and take them over. This was right at the beginning of the famous 100 Days campaign, in which the Canadian troops led the attack that ended the war. But unfortunately, William was killed right at the start when the men jumped off and left their trenches. He was killed by a shell shortly after leaving, and that was the end of his war. A story like thousands of others, but I was able to get into the mind of what he was thinking and why he may have joined up. But there were other reasons, and we're going to go through some of the other Malvern men as case histories. So let's move on here. Learning to fly. The Wright brothers had only started flying in 1903, and here we are in 1915, just 12 years later, and already aircraft are becoming a military weapon, mainly for observing the opposing troops, but then eventually it got into fighter planes to shoot down the observing planes, and then it got into bombers and more fighters to shoot down the bombers. So it escalated pretty quickly. But right from the start, men were really excited about learning how to fly, and they could take training down the Toronto Islands at the Curtis Flying School. Canada did not have an Air Force. They didn't want one. They considered it was going to be too expensive and too big a thing for them to get into. So they said to the UK, feel free to come into Canada and recruit pilots, and good luck to it, because we're not going to pay the bill. So the Royal Naval Air Service and the Royal Flying Corps were both in Toronto from an early date recruiting. And that's where they met Gordon Ezra Duke. And here he is, young Duke over here on the left. He was a university student preparing to go to engineering school. He was supporting his widowed mother. But he made the decision to go to the Curtis School, which was a private school, because in those days you had to have your pilot's certificate before you could join the Air Force. So he used his $400 in tuition money to pay for 4 months of training, which is about $10,000 in today's money. And he spent 3 months down in the islands flying this little flying boat that you see here until November came. And as we know, in the days before global warming, Toronto got to be cold, snowy place in November. They halted the flying, and before his training was up, so he couldn't get his certificate. All of the pilots in his situation were quite angry that they couldn't finish their training and get into the war. It caused a bit of a scandal. There was even a delegation that went up to Ottawa to see Sir Sam Hughes. It became a bit of a thing. And then finally, the Royal Navy stepped in and said, we will pay your way over to England, and you can finish your last month and do your final training with the Royal Navy, and then you'll get into the war, no problem. So problem solved. So Duke was among the first contingent whose passage to England was paid for. He left in late December. He arrived about January 1st or 2nd. And by January 10th, he had been killed in his first training flight. This is a short 39. Short was the manufacturer of this rickety old thing. It's a two-seater for training. And both he and his instructor, a fellow from Australia, were killed. And the problem with a design like this aircraft is the motor's behind you. And so if you go down and crash nose first, the engine comes after you and crushes you, which is what happened to both of them. They weren't up that high, but one of the control wires broke and they just went down, and that was the end of them. I was able to find a whole detailed newspaper story about it in several papers. The museum, the Royal Naval Museum in England, was very helpful, and so I found out the whole story about Gordon Ezra Duke's final flight. Very sad. Arthur Jackson Smith Bud Sisley, one of the three Sisley brothers. A lot of you may know that the corner house at Main and Kingston Road, number 2 Main Street is what it used to be. That was the home of Dr. Opie Sisley, a known Liberal politician in this area and a doctor. His 3 sons all joined the Air Force. Max, the oldest brother, Bud, and the youngest brother, Donovan. And we'll hear more about him in a second. But Bud signed up with the artillery first and was in the trenches and the mud, a lot like Billy Bishop. And the two of them had the same idea, was to get out of the mud and get up in the sky where it was clean and bright, and they thought it would be a better place to fight. So he was on an extended leave. I think he had he got ill, tonsils or something. And in those days, that was a serious thing that took you out of action for a while. He was sent back home to extended leave, and he joined the Air Force back in Toronto and came back to England for his training. Here he is on the left in his officer airman cadet's uniform. Up in the top right, that is a Sopwith Camel, the famous aircraft, one of the most famous ones in the war. And that's an actual Camel from his squadron, 70 Squadron. Within 6 weeks of arriving at his squadron, he was shot down and killed by a German ace, Werner Voss, who himself was killed 13 days later. 1917 was a very bad year for flyers. April especially, it was called Bloody April. And that was how Bud Sisley met his end. So back to 1916, the next, we're now into the second year of the war, and the Somme. I know a lot of you may have heard of the Somme. It was the most significant battle of the war in terms of its political impact. People were shocked that almost 60,000 men could be lost in a single day. And in fact, 54,470 casualties, including 19,240 men killed in the first day of the battle. And it went on for months. 43 Malvernites volunteered in this year. 38 of them survived the war, and all of them enlisted before the Somme. And after the Somme, I'm betting that a lot of them had second thoughts and said, well, maybe we're not going to sign up right away. Only one Malvernite was killed at the Battle of the Somme, and that was Martin James Flood. And here's another a continuation of the roster. The photo at the right is of a young man from Silverthorne Collegiate in Etobicoke. He joined a group of Malvern students who went over to France for the Vimy reunion, the 100th anniversary of Vimy, the Battle of Vimy Ridge, and he went to see his great uncle on the Vimy Memorial, and that's him pointing to the name, and the name was Thomas Murray Watson. And he was very pleased to be able to go and see that bit of history and be there. And the 100th anniversary of Vimy was quite an event. On to 1917, bloody April, as I said, very, very costly period of the air war. A lot of men were killed that month. Vimy, of course, 10,000 Canadians were killed at Vimy. It was quite a vicious battle, but Canadians made a name for themselves by taking that ridge when none of the other troops could do it. And then the year ended with the horrible slog in the mud known as Passchendaele. So it was a very hard year for the troops, especially for one who's not from our area, but Colonel Sam Sharp was the commander of the 116th Battalion. He's from Uxbridge. And the new leader of the Conservative Party, there's John Ellis coming in. Aaron O'Toole made an effort to get Sam Sharp recognized with a plaque in the lobby of Parliament, and he succeeded. But Sam Sharp was a decorated hero. He fought at Passchendaele. He lost a lot of his men, and then when he came back from the war, he was so upset, suffering from PTSD and the trauma and the thought of having to go back home and see the relatives of all the boys he'd recruited and who died. He couldn't take it, and he jumped out of his hospital window in Montreal and killed himself. Very sad tale. And his plaque wasn't put anywhere. He was there were 2 MPs in the war, killed in the war. His plaque was never put up because it was the stigma of suicide, and it took 100 years for people to come to understand PTSD and overcome that. So he will be in there once they finish renovating Parliament. We continue with the names in 1917. The person at the bottom there is Roy Wesley Kerr. He also joined the Air Force, and that plane on the right is a Sopwith Dolphin, a newer, more powerful plane, double guns. The arms race in the Air Force was progressing apace, and the planes are getting bigger and faster and more deadly. But by this time, recruitment was slowing. As I mentioned in an earlier talk about recruitment, the papers had been filled with reports of men being killed and wounded for 3 years. People were well aware what a bloody show it was, and conscription was coming because the recruiting had trickled to almost nothing. Conscription was announced on the 29th of August. It started in January 1918. And then this year, 1917, 27 Malvernites enlisted. And here's the end of the 1917 list. And casualty on this page is Donovan Laurier Sisley, the third of the Sisley brothers. That's him as a young cadet. He was in the Cadet Corps at University of Toronto. He flew a big observation plane known as the Big Ack. He would be the pilot in the front seat, sorry, and the observer who would take pictures of the trenches and the enemy troops and guns and things. He would be in the back. 1918, the final year of the war. A lot of people do a thing called telescoping history. They know that the war ended in 1918, and so you figure, okay, 1918, we're getting near the end, and you can see it coming, and it's like, now we know the war was ending. No. They were making plans for new offensives in 1919. They figured the war would go on at least for another year, and they were wondering how they were going to be able to keep fighting for a year. And the Germans, in particular, were worried about the Americans coming. The Americans entered the war in 1917, excuse me, and with their millions of men that were going to come. And the Germans said, we better make a big push before they arrive and try and end this war. So this is the Germans entering a big salient, a big push, and they actually advanced about 25 miles into Allied territory. Our troops were retreating at quite a pace. But as happened with all offensives, they eventually would outrun their supply lines, and the Allied troops were able to stiffen up their defenses, stop the advance, and start to push the Germans back. And by August, as I mentioned with Private Heel, by August, the Canadian troops were leading the 100 Days campaign, and the war was a few months away from ending. 18 Malvernites enlisted this year, all but one in the first 5 months. And here are their names. All of these ones survived the war, which is nice to see. Some of them avoided, some of them wanted, as I said, wanted to avoid being labeled as draftees or conscripts. So the Military Service Act was the official name of the Conscription Act, and a lot of them volunteered before they were labeled as draftees. Others, like Donovan Laurier, Sicily, he wanted to join his brothers, and he had just come of age by this time and made it over to the war. So there were lots of motivations for men wanting to enlist, and that was just one of them. And then here we are at the end of the war. I think I showed this slide once before. This is the Black Watch regiment in Canada entering Mons and liberating the city on the final day of the war. So as you can see, there were lots of men enlisting throughout the war. It did have its peaks and valleys as the war progressed and men knew what they were getting into, but I hope this gives you some insight as to what they were thinking of, what was motivating them, why. I always wonder when I study a man, why did he decide to enlist? And it's a great question, and every time I do a story, I try and figure it out and see. And with Private Heel, I was lucky to find quite a story behind it. And this is a little ad for my association, another copy of my magazine, and my email address if anybody wants to email me and question me on anything about any of the men's names you saw. And there you go. That's my presentation on why they enlisted.